One of the topics that you talk about is the reactions that people often have when they're told by somebody that they've joined the military. Specifically, like if they're like an Ivy League grad and they're like, "Oh yeah, I joined the military." People kind of treat it as like, I don't know if an anomaly is the right way to put it, but maybe let's just like start talking about how some of the perceptions that the
Yeah.
public has about the military have.
This is like a very feels like a very Northeast specific thing, right? Where you'll encounter people, and I would sometimes encounter people where I was the first veteran they knowingly met, right? This is after, we'd already been at war for a decade. And there were people who would say to me directly, like, "Oh, like you went to a good college. Like that's amazing that you joined the military." Like you were somehow slumming it by joining the military, or that that if you had any other options, this wasn't something that you would do, rather than something that might be expected of someone during a time of war, right? The military is very geographically defined, right? There's certain regions that send a lot of people to the military. It's also increasingly a family business. A lot of people who go into the military have military family. In fact, actually, there was a recent Ben Kesling is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, has an article about how, in the wake of unsuccessful wars, the military is finding a recruiting problem because older family members are sort of warning away some of the younger family members from joining the military uh, for the fairly obvious reason that people who served in the past 20 years have less confidence in the leadership and the missions that they've been sent on than in years past. So yeah, so there's this weird thing where in certain pockets of the country, military service is like, oh, it's like, oh, that's something for the peons, right? Which is something I react against. Or there's this idea that it's like, oh, it's only what you would do if you have no other options. It must be only to get out of poverty. I remember a friend of mine was talking at an event. He's black, right? And not from a wealthy family. And there were sort of these like people asking him, sort of projecting on him that he had only joined the military because of, the poverty draft or whatever. At a certain point, he was like, no, 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 I wanted to join the Marine Corps since I was 4 years old, right? And there was a sort of weird and uncomfortable and particular type of sort of racialized projection that was happening with, you know, uh, this is what you look like and this is your background. Therefore, you joining the military must have been an act of desperation, not not a choice or an act of patriotism or service.
Yeah, you're so right when you talk about the geographic, differences with the military. So I grew up in a very rural, conservative part of northern Indiana,
Right.
and yeah, and I grew up during the Iraq War. So I was born in 1992. So you're about 10 years older than me. I think you write it in your book, so I can bring it up
Yeah.
as you've given me permission to do. So like when I was growing up, you know, Iraq, I was 10 years old when we invaded Iraq, and in my community, to go into the military was this extremely honorable thing to do. It was very idealized, and it wasn't until later that I've lived in New York for a while, and I'm in Washington D.C. now. It wasn't until later that I kind of got hip to some of these other perceptions of what it means to join the military and what service in the military to a lot of other people actually means. So
Yeah,
you're so
I talk
right.
a lot in the book about the sort of the civil military divide and this sort of sense of alienation that some people feel and the disconnect. And a buddy of mine, a special forces veteran who lives in a rural town in Maine, reached out to me. He's like, I read your book, and he's like, I liked it, but I don't know what you're talking about. Like in my town, like everybody knows somebody who served. I was like, yeah, in your town,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And it's just a radically different, one of these essays, people got very annoyed by one thing that I quoted a friend of mine as saying. The journalist and Iraq and Afghan vet Jacob Siegel, he admitted to me of having this kind of like instinctive recoil against men our age who didn't serve in the military, and said, "It's unfair, but I feel that. Who excused you, you know?" Or another way of putting it that would be, "Why did you think you had a choice? I know it's a volunteer army, but the volunteer army is a trick question, you know? You're supposed to say yes if you have any honor." And that's one view, right? That subsegments of the population feel. And then there's this other view, it's like the military is what you do if you're desperate, or why would you join the military, or there's something morally suspect in joining the military because look at what we've wrought, look at the suffering and devastation overseas. Not only is it not something that you ought do, but it's something that you should be judged for having done, right? If you supported the war, if you were enthusiastic, if you wanted to be a part of it, that's like a moral stain on your honor.